Now, if you're a cleaner, a checkout operator, a plumber, a joiner, you'll be worse off in an independent Scotland. Well, that's what Labour MP and Shadow International Development Secretary Jim Murphy will claim on behalf of the Better Together campaign in a speech in Glasgow later this morning. He'll argue that independence will have a particularly negative effect on those who have least to lose, those hard-pressed working families who barely get by from one wage packet to the next. Well, Mr Murphy joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Can you just outline why you think this will be the case? Why will these people be worse off?
Well, there are still a lot of undecided voters still to make up their minds, including many of those who struggle from time to time to make ends meet. They want to do what's best for their families and their country, but it's now clear that mortgages and credit cards will cost more. In an independent Scotland, those families
How do you know that? How do you know that?
It's independent experts have looked at it, and they said that the risk that's associated with becoming an independent state would increase the cost of interest, which would then be passed on to families. So a family taking out a typical mortgage of £80,000, even if it's just a 1% increase, they're £800 a year worse off just in mortgage costs alone.
Does this come from some of the figures which George Osborne and Danny Alexander referred to recently? But in fact, it was also shown that credit agencies considered that Scotland would not have a seriously concerning credit rating.
No, these figures aren't government figures. They're the National Institute of Economic Research figures. So they're independent, they're beyond reproach, and they're not from any side of the campaign. The voters who can help make the difference in this referendum are more likely to be the bus drivers, the hospital porters, the plumbers, the joiners, the checkout operators and the cleaners. These are clever and pragmatic and patriotic Scots. They've been campaigned at by the SNP for 2 years, and they've not been convinced. That's because these folk are increasingly realising the cost of independence will be passed on to them. The working poor always pay the price for disruption. It's always been the case throughout my lifetime. You think about the big shocks that have been over the years, the oil shock in the 70s, the election of Mrs Thatcher in the 80s, the 2008 financial crisis. Those who are furthest from power and those who can least afford it pay the highest price and they pay it for longest.
All those situations, you have to agree that actually it was your party that was in power. I mean, the situation Margaret Thatcher came into, she didn't just create that in a matter of months. It was there before. Similarly, with the financial situation, Labour was in charge when everything got out of control in the first place.
I think that's quite creative journalism to say that.
I think it's quite true if you look at who was in power at those points in history.
For Mrs Thatcher. It's a bit creative to say that the Labour Party is at fault for Mrs Thatcher. If you want to get into the blame game, it was the SNP who voted with the Tories in the 70s.
The UK was virtually bankrupt
that brought about Mrs Thatcher.
Before Mrs Thatcher came to power, when Labour was in power. The UK actually was seeking a loan from the IMF.
Yeah, I'm not really here to make an argument of virtues or otherwise of Mrs Thatcher.
No, I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to accept that actually the Labour Party was in a position to do something about those situations where you claim the poorest people were the worse off. And if you're saying that would be the case again with an independent Scotland, Mr Murphy, I mean, what you're doing this morning is saying to a large group of still, as you say, undecided voters, you're not coming out and offering them something positive to look forward to by remaining part of the UK. You're doing what the Better Together campaign does time and time again. You're coming here, you're speaking out, you're being negative, and you're saying they'll be worse off, but you're not saying how they'd be better off by staying as they are.
I get the feeling I should be interviewing you.
Well, why don't you answer that? Do you not accept that you're being negative once again?
No, not at all. Look, the fact is, how more negative can you be than wanting to leave and make the rest of the United Kingdom a foreign country? The very virtue of that is driven by a sense of negativity. The fact is that we can have more power in Scotland and we can have less poverty in Scotland while remaining in the United Kingdom. Joanne Lamont will set out tomorrow more powers in Scotland in the Scottish Parliament, and the argument I'm making today is that we should have less poverty. But the truth is,
why don't?
Hayley, I wonder if I can just answer your question, and then we can have another one. But the situation is that no matter what the question, no matter what the circumstance, no matter what the consequence is, the SNP's answer is always the same. They always want out, whether it was during the oil shock, whether it was during Mrs Thatcher, whether it was after the Second World War when the Labour government was forming the NHS, or whether the NHS was underfunded. in the 80s, whether it was when Attlee was building homes fit for heroes or whether it was the bedroom tax that's hurting so many people now, the answer is always the same. They want out of the United Kingdom. It's not a nimble response to current circumstances. It's just why they exist. And the problem is, that's their dream. They're entitled to that policy, but the working poor will pay the price of it because of higher interest rates,
why can't you look at your policy and what you could do for these people? Charles Kennedy will be talking this morning about you and others from the Better Together campaign should be being more positive, that it's too negative. I mean, look at what this group of people face at the moment by being part of the UK. People are having to use credit cards in some cases to pay their mortgage and to pay rent. More and more people in Scotland are having to access food banks to survive, to feed their families from day to day. Many people might look at the referendum and say, well, do you know what? I'm not sure we could be any worse off by voting yes. They're not exactly having a fantastic standard of living at the moment, are they? What are you know, what can you say to them? What can you give them? But, you know, to convince them?
I think actually that's a very fair point. I actually think that's a very fair point, is that back in 1997, Labour got elected off of a sentiment that things could only get better, and we made dramatic changes.
And have they?
But there are a substantial number of voters, however, now who think that things can't get any worse. And this referendum isn't a choice between the unfair status quo versus the uncosted risk of making the rest of the United Kingdom a foreign country. It's about different versions of change. That's what's going to be on the ballot paper. It's devolved change.
But you're not offering them a version of change, are you? You're offering them more of the same.
No, I think you'd have to be pretty cynical to come to that view. The fact is that we can have a more powerful Scottish Parliament, we can have less poverty in our communities, we can have people having an opportunity to live fulfilled lives, but you don't have to change your passport to do that. You just have to change your government.
Okay.
The fact is that David Cameron is temporary. He'll be gone within a year. Independence is permanent, it's irreversible, and the working poor will pay the price for that.
OK, Jim Murphy, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us this morning. Well, listening to that in the studio with us is the SNP's Bob Doris. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
What do you make of that claim that really this group of people, the low-paid particularly, would be worse off in an independent Scotland?
I really don't think Jim Murphy and the Better Together campaign have got any credibility in relation to this. To be honest with you, I think it was a panic attack from Mr Murphy. He sees a section of society who are moving towards yes in large numbers, and he's trying to step in, give misinformation and use Project Fear to scare people who have got the most to gain with independence. And
what can you offer this group of voters then? Can you offer them something in a positive vein?
Well, let me just tell you three things that would help the hospital porters and the clearers that Jim Murphy was pretending that a no vote would benefit, and it clearly wouldn't. So, for example, the first thing I would say to you is that the national minimum wage does not go up by the rate of inflation, and it should do. Had that happened in the last 5 years, then the poorest workers in Scotland would be hundreds and hundreds of pounds better off. Now, as a result of that, with independence, we've guaranteed to make that happen. Let me give you a second example. The taxation system in Britain does not favour women in particular. The earnings disregard you get against tax for second income earners in a household, mainly women, needs to be equalised. This would make women up to £1,200 better off, 70,000 people. There's a second example. Let me give you a third example in relation to childcare. A transformational step change in childcare, meaning that all families in Scotland, from when their child is from the age of 1 onwards, will get the same childcare flexible provision, the same as if they were at primary school. That's a huge step change that will help the poorest people in society the most. Those are three concrete examples of why the poorest in society will be better off with independence.
But expensive as well.
Well, I'm delighted you mentioned that this costs money, because, for example, the first tranche of the childcare plans, we've estimated £500 million will start to achieve some of that.
And yet you've been
However,
able to do this. You've been able to start this process of, as you are now, as we are part of the UK. So couldn't you just continue with that?
I'm delighted you use that as an example, because one of the things that happens is you get people off of benefits and into work. Is when you offer benefits, that's a tax saving to the UK Exchequer. As you get them into work, that's a tax gain to the UK Exchequer. As they start to spend money in the real economy, that's a further tax gain to the UK Exchequer. Without independence, these hundreds of millions of pounds that will flow to the UK Exchequer because of Scottish Government policies has to be brought back to Scotland to be used to fight for the very vulnerable people that Jim Murphy talks about. That's why we need independence. It's not just a soundbite. It's not just a glib soundbite from Project Fear. The independence movement wants to help the most vulnerable people in society, and Jim Murphy is blocking that with Better Together and his Tory colleagues.
But there is only so much you can actually, I suppose, forecast in all of this, because you don't know at the end of the day what it might cost the government of an independent Scotland to provide all of this, because at the end of the day, Jim Murphy did make a point that with an independent Scotland, we have, you know, such uncertainty still over what currency would be used, let alone anything else. That's creating a lot of uncertainty, not least for the markets. And if Scotland was deemed to be a higher risk, if its debt was higher risk, then that could make the cost of living more expensive for people here.
Again, I'm delighted you raised that as a question, because it allows me to debunk another lie that Mr Murphy told on the interview with you just moments ago, because Standards & Poor's, an internationally renowned credit ratings agency, said that Scotland was of the highest standards in terms of what a credit rating would be with independence. Indeed, it
but
wasn't.
The uncertainty over a currency could throw that all into doubt. Do you not accept that?
Well, I don't believe there will be uncertainty over a currency. The pound makes sense for both partners, and I think there's a growing realisation of that. What I do know, the cost to Scotland right now, for example, is £257 million just to mitigate UK Tory welfare cuts to this country. £4.5 billion taken away from the poorest people in Scottish society. Only a yes vote, only independence can turn the lives around of the most vulnerable people in Scotland.
OK, well, this debate will no doubt rage throughout the day. Thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you.
The SNP MSP Bob Doris.